Good morning, everybody. Happy Thursday. We have an amazing show for everybody today. What do we have, Krystal?
Indeed, we do. So many interesting stories to get to this morning. Some new polls out regarding Biden's approval, also how people are feeling about those new vaccine mandates and requirements that he's put into place. Some stunning and horrific testimony from some of the women who were abused by Larry Nassar, specifically with regards, they were scathing about the FBI lying, burying this, allowing girls to continue to be victimized by this man. We'll bring you all the latest there. Also an interesting case, 3 former CIA intelligence officers who apparently were doing a lot of work for UAE that was not necessarily legal, and looks like they were using their tradecraft to spy on Americans on behalf of the UAE, so we'll give you all the details there. Also, yes, we will bring you up to speed on Nicki Minaj's cousin's friend's balls.
Correct. Everything you need to know.
There's like 5,000 new updates there.
And
so
layers,
we'll give you, all kinds of layers, heroes, villains. It's all very complicated and very interesting. We'll bring you that. We've also got David Dayen on to break down exactly what's going on with that Medicare prescription drug pricing. Democrats have long promised, this was a core campaign promise, that they were going to start negotiating with drug companies to lower prescription drug prices. It's supported by literally 90% of Americans. And yet now you have a couple of, frankly, corporate assholes who are standing in the way and trying to block that proposal. So we're going to talk to David Dayen about what exactly is going on there. But we wanted to start this morning with the big results out of California, an utter shellacking for the Republicans who were hoping to recall Governor Gavin Newsom.
No other way to describe it. Let's go ahead and put the New York Times tear sheet up there on the screen. It shows the vote totals there with 63.9% coming in at no, yes coming in at 36%. As Krystal pointed out before the show, they oddly put no in red, so it seems like it's Republican, and then blue for yes. But the geography there does seem actually kind of interesting. Really what it is the mega populated areas not only came in to keep Gavin Newsom, but came in heavily. The rural areas part of the state, especially up there in Northern California, more deserty part, they all came in for the recall. So if we dig down into the actual vote, also I should say that the 64% or around that of what Gavin Newsom ultimately was able to prevail within the recall is roughly equivalent by around 2 points to how he won election back in 2018 in the first place. So a stunning show out for the governor. But would be remiss if we didn't say that the composition of the people who voted within the recall shows again the accelerants of the trends that we saw in the 2020 election. So Nate Cohn over at the New York Times, they dug a little bit into the exit polling here. You can see that, which is that Newsom fared better amongst white college graduates than non-white voters in the state. And he isn't even faring better among Latino than non-Latino voters. So just to break it down for you there, the education by race, white voters with a college degree came out at 70% within the recall. White voters with no degree came out 57% for the recall. Same thing whenever it's voters of color with a college degree, 63%, voters of color no degree, then it drops to 59. So it's a little bit different. And on race in particular, you can see there, white, black, Latino, and Asian, Newsom won across the board. But actually the lowest percentage that he got was actually amongst white voters. So it's a very, very polarized country. It seems California, which is very much like the rest of the country, is just as polarized as we are. And Krystal, Steve Kornacki also pointed out, let's put it up there, in terms of education polarization. This is the most important one, in my opinion, because you can see 2018 compared to 2021, white college-educated voters came out at 59% for Newsom in 2018. In 2021, 68%. White non-college, he actually won that back in 2018. Today in 2021, 57%, like I said, voted for the recall. So the drop is actually precipitous amongst white non-college educated voters, and the Hispanic vote share dropped from 64% to 58%. That's what the governor is dealing with. It's the exact same story across the country. The semi-minor drop amongst Latinos basically mirrors the 7 to 8% bump the GOP got, and then the 10-point jump amongst white college voters. That's the story of the 2020 election and why Biden is president today.
Yeah, I mean, it shows you, number one, why Biden is president today. It also shows you that the influx of some Latino voters to the Republican Party to vote for Donald Trump is not necessarily a one-off occurrence.
Correct.
So there always is a question, because he's such a singular figure, whether this is just, this particular election because he's on the ballot. You've consistently seen now that splitting of Latino voters. Look, still Gavin Newsom wins.
He still won the majority.
Still wins the group. And there's also, it's notable that there's less of an education divide among Latino voters than there are among white voters. But still, you see that sort of steady bleeding that I think Democrats should be very concerned about. They had long thought, demographics are destiny. This is our new coalition. These are the people. They just sort of assumed, and that's part of the problem, is that there weren't ongoing efforts to actually understand this community, reach out to this community, form ties, communicate with this community in a way that's authentic and makes sense. So those problems continuing to emerge for Democrats. But I mean, obviously the big story here is that Gavin Newsom, it wasn't even close.
Yeah, he won big.
In a very unusual situation, he actually outperformed the polls, which normally Democrats recently have been underperforming whatever the polls say. He did even better than what the polls said going in. There was obviously a late surge. His messaging of, listen, if you're worried about the pandemic and staying safe and you want to keep this Trumpist maniac out of office, then you got to show up and vote, worked very, very well, especially as you point out with white college educated voters who are now the sort of primary base of the Democratic Party that they really cater to and really focus on. They have a lot of power within the party, regardless of what their numbers are, and their numbers within the party continue to ultimately increase. There were also some interesting commentary from some California Republican consultants who were very upset at both Trump and Larry Elder, basically at the end saying, oh, this thing is rigged, and suppressing voter turnout, which I think also helps to account for why you had this late surge for Newsom, because they also had not been pushing people to vote by mail in the same way that Democratic voters have been being pushed to vote by mail. So they were really counting on a big day of turnout.
It just didn't happen.
And when it didn't happen, because why? In part, it's got to be because you got the president, leader of the party, and the guy that you're supposed to be electing saying the whole thing's rigged anyway, so why bother?
It's so stupid and foolish, and it mirrors exactly what happened in Georgia. And look, this is the problem. Trump is both simultaneously the driver of turnout on the Democratic side. Why do you think these white college-educated voters came out so hard for Gavin Newsom? Because every single ad, every single thing they talked about, Trump, 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 Trump. All those photos, as you pointed out, that's the worst photo Larry Elder ever took in his life, is a photo of him with a thumbs up next to Trump.
In every ad.
That's the problem, Larry, is that simultaneously the Republican base may love Trump, but if you juxtapose it onto the entire general electorate, especially in a state which is mega Democratic, and then you depress turnout on your own side, you have a complete and total disaster. And that's exactly what happened. I predict this is what's going to happen in Virginia too, Krystal, because we've talked about Youngkin and all of that, but it just seems that Trump in particular is such an inspiring figure for Democrats to come out and vote. And you pointed a lot of this during the 2020 election, which is, this is all Dems have to do. They just have to be like, look, you want Trump to win? And people are like, oh God, no, Trump. And that's enough. They will come out and they will vote, they'll crawl over glass in order to make sure they can put that mail-in ballot. And at the same time, Trump is out there saying, well, the election was rigged. It's totally stolen. Yeah. So why bother come out and vote?
Why bother?
It's like you're basically giving an in-kind donation to the other side's voters. It's one of the dumbest things you can do electorally.
Yeah, I mean, this is pretty embarrassing ultimately for Republicans who really genuinely had a chance at this thing. And the beginning of August, the polls were tied. Obviously, there's precedent not that long ago. A couple things are definitely different. Number one, Gray Davis was less popular than Gavin Newsom, who never actually really dipped below 50% in terms of his approval rating. You didn't have a candidate like Arnold Schwarzenegger, who's both well-known and well-liked, and also a moderate who can appeal to a broader base in California. Instead, they lean into this guy who's, fairly fringe character and wildly out of step with what the general population of California actually wants. Republicans really leaned into the sort of pandemic culture war messaging. And I think thought that their anti-lockdown positioning was a lot more popular in California than it actually is. If you look at the exit polls, and this is my own tweet, we can throw up here on the screen, 2/3 of California voters said the state's pandemic restrictions were either just right or not strict enough.
Yeah.
So Republicans thought they had a real winning issue with anti-lockdown. Meanwhile, down the stretch, Gavin Newsom is leaning into, hey, I'm the one who put vaccine mandates in place for teachers and for healthcare workers. And by the way, and I actually thought this was smart messaging, his message on that wasn't like, we're pro-lockdown. It was, if you don't have these precautions in place, we're gonna have to close schools again. So Larry Elder is the guy that's gonna lead to your kids not being able to go to school again. And in California, and actually we're gonna cover some polling later, in a lot of the country now, with Delta variant surging and people feeling a lot more uncertain, some basic pandemic precautions are really popular. So I think Republicans overlearned some of the lessons of 2020, where they saw this surge of Latino voters. Yeah. They saw that the polling didn't really reflect how people were feeling about lockdowns and the economy and all of that, and leaned hard in that direction when certainly in a place like California, but also I would say in a lot of the country, it doesn't land the way that they think it is. And the polling has moved in this regard as Delta has gotten worse. People have adjusted. And now, whereas earlier in the summer, they were feeling like, okay, let's get back to normal. Let's take the masks off. Let's go back to school with like all the normal sort of modes of doing that. Now there's a lot more hesitancy, a lot more caution, a lot more fear about the virus itself.
No, and this is important for a corollary for everybody to understand, which is we had to adjust the way we thought about lockdowns after the election. But this is the first election where we've had in arguably the most pro-lockdown state. And look, I mean, vote doesn't lie, right? Like that's what you always have to look is what did the actual number come out to be? And so, yeah, it's true. I certainly overestimated what I thought would be a largely popular, not uprising necessarily, but 40% of the state or so that I thought might be able to be mobilized. At the same time, Democrats feel apathetic. Nobody really likes Gavin Newsom, the homeless problem, crime, etc.
Yeah.
Look, the guy basically not just won. I mean, he won around the exact same level that came out in 2018 when the state was arguably a lot better off. So what does that mean? It means that some of this stuff is popular in California. Now, trying to extrapolate that across the country, we're about to get to that into the polling block, but I'm scrambled because at the same time, definitely got burned on all the lockdown polling that came out before the 2020 election. At the same time, we see, Biden also throws a wrench in this, but the vaccine has also changed things in the way that people think about it. We should also, I'd be remiss if we didn't just hammer this home. This is what Dem messaging is gonna, I think this might actually be the best chance they have in the midterms. Not in terms to win, but in terms to try and stave off, is all they have to do is say Trump's name all day long. Check out what Gavin Newsom said when he declared victory.
I said this many, many times on the campaign trail. We may have defeated Trump, but Trumpism is not dead in this country. The big lie, January 6th insurrection, all the voting suppression efforts that are happening all across this country, what's happening, the assault on fundamental rights, constitutionally protected rights of women and girls. It's a remarkable moment in our nation's history.
I just find it
robot.
so irritating. All of these politicians who came up in the Obama era and mimic his speech patterns and his mannerisms and he's like an obvious example of that. Cory Booker, Pete Buttigieg is probably the worst example of that. Anyway, irritating. But yeah, the question has always been, okay, did the Democratic base just go back to brunch? And it was looking like that in California.
Well, they're here now.
In August, it was really looking like these people don't really care. They're kind of apathetic. They're, kind of like whatever with regards to politics. They're a little tuned out. They're not watching cable news every hour of the day anymore, which is probably a better state overall. But when it came down to a choice of, all right, listen, you may not love me, but look at this guy and check out this picture of him with Trump. They showed up, and they showed up in droves. And so, look, again, let me say, I think Democrats are pretty much screwed for the midterms because historically it's hard. They didn't do what they need to do with regards to redistricting reform. So they have, 6-7 point disadvantage coming in. Biden, we're about to get to, his approval rating, not great. There's a lot of uncertainty, all these problems. So I think Democrats have a very, very, very steep hill to climb. But they should take some heart from this so that when the chips were down, they were able to freak out and terrify their base enough to get them to show up.
Well, that's going to be their strategy come 2022.
Hey guys, thanks so much for watching.
That's right. Just as a reminder, you can become a premium subscriber today. Watch the full show completely uncut, our reactions to each other's monologues. You get to listen to it. You get to ask us questions, all that good stuff. Link is right there in the description or at breakingpoints.com.
Best of all, great way to say screw you to the mainstream media.